Evening all. In the spring of 1919, a group of German politicians met at the German town of Weimar to write what was was the most liberal constitution of any country in Europe at the time. For example, it guaranteed equal voting rights to women at the same age as men, which didn't happen in this country, in Great Britain, until 1930. And the Weimar Republic, as it became known, the period of German democracy from 1919 right through to 1933, was in many ways constitutionally the most liberal in Europe. And yet we all know what happened in 1933. It was replaced by the Nazi dictatorship, which really came into being on March the 23rd, 1933, with the passing of the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler full legal dictatorial powers. Now, the question of why the Weimar Republic collapsed, why Germany went from what was basically the most liberal constitution in Europe to Nazi dictatorship, is one of the key questions that exists in modern 20th century history. And one of the big mistakes that's made about the Weimar Republic and about the issue of why it collapsed is to over-concentrate on the problems of its early years. And it's a classic mistake. Students doing it in exams, when asked about why the Weimar Republic collapsed, it's not uncommon for 3/4 of the flipping answer to be about the problems between 1918 and 1923. But in my view, that misses the point. And to look at the reasons for the Weimar Republic's collapse, you have to concentrate more on the events from 1929 onwards, the very last years of the Weimar Republic, because it's in the last years of the Weimar Republic that the key to its collapse lies. Now, it's certainly the case that the Weimar Republic did have long-term weaknesses that existed right from the start, things that would make democracy very difficult to survive in Germany. And yet the idea that these weaknesses doomed the Weimar Republic from the start, I think, is ill-conceived and wrong. What were some of the long-term weaknesses then? Well, it's certainly the case that the Weimar Republic was born out of them losing the First World War, and the losing of the First World War led to two revolutions, basically. A revolution from above, where power was passed down from the army high command and people like Ludendorff down to the Weimar Reichstag politicians, later known as the Weimar politicians, in order to pass the blame for losing the war. Then there was a revolution from below, where the people themselves rose up in the cities, and there were riots and demonstrations when they found out they were losing the war. All of this culminated in the abdication of the Kaiser on the 9th of November 1918, so the imperial system ended. So the Weimar Republic was born out of losing a war and out of revolution. Pressure from the Americans helped push them down the democratic road. Woodrow Wilson made it a condition of negotiating with the Germans. So it is the case, it is valid to say that democracy in Germany was not something that necessarily was born out of normal circumstances. It resulted from the end of the war. It's also the case that the Weimar Republic was saddled with the Treaty of Versailles very quickly on, with its harsh terms. Germany lost about 10% of its total industrial output. It lost about 13% of its territory, and with some industries like iron and steel, it was getting on for 50% of the total output that was lost in the territorial losses. They also lost a huge chunk of territory known as the Polish Corridor, West Prussia and Poznania, which split East Prussia away from the rest of Germany. These were major territorial losses. Alsace-Lorraine was another one. In addition, they were saddled with the reparations, which was the most damaging aspect of the Treaty of Versailles, which in 1921 was set at £6.6 billion, or the German equivalent. And the reparations had to be paid in instalments in goods, over a long period of time, and between 10 and 20% of what the German economy was producing in the early years of the Weimar Republic was given away in reparations. So it is the case that it was saddled with some of these really difficult problems. And it is also true that the Weimar Constitution that was written in the spring of 1919 by politicians such as Friedrich Ebert, who became the first German president, did contain fundamental weaknesses. For example, Article 48, which said that in an emergency the president could use emergency powers, which basically means ruling by decree, and the president could decide what an emergency was, which was later used and undermined democracy. And the idea of having an enabling act clause, and the idea that you could pass a law with a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag to give the Chancellor, who was basically the German Prime Minister, full dictatorial powers, initially for 4 years, but obviously it could be extended. I mean, such a clause in the Constitution is an obvious problem. So there are weaknesses in the Weimar Constitution, and of course in the early years of the Weimar Republic, Germany suffered from the twin problems of political extremism and economic difficulties. With political extremism, of course, there were three serious attempts to overthrow the Weimar Republic. There was the Spartacist uprising in January 1919. That was the communists, the left, trying it. Then there were two right-wing putsches, the Kapp Putsch in March 1920 and the Beer Hall Putsch, or Munich Putsch, the first one that Hitler was involved in, which was in November 1923. So there are attempts by extremists to overthrow the Republic. Now, the economic problems in the early years were, of course, culminating in the hyperinflation year of 1923, where the mark basically lost its value, and you needed billions and billions of marks to equal $1 American, and people were shopping with pram loads of money, and people, as a protest, were wallpapering their house with money, etc., etc. So the early years of the Weimar Republic were difficult. Add to that into the mix the fact they had proportional representation as a voting system, constantly changing coalition governments, and you do have a very difficult situation. However, what I don't think is that any of those problems doomed the Weimar Republic to failure from the start, and the Treaty of Versailles didn't doom it from the start. And it's also the case that I don't believe in this kind of A.J.P. Taylor Sonderweg argument that Germany had such a tradition of nationalism that something was bound to overthrow democracy and replace it with a more nationalistic government, ultimately the Nazis, but it could have been, a similarly nationalistic group. I don't believe there's any truth in that argument either. Why not then? Well, for a start, although the Weimar Republic had problems in the early years, you have to ask the question, was it in danger of being overthrown by something else seriously in the early years? Was there an alternative, a popular alternative to democracy? And the answer is no. For a start, the communists were crushed in 1919 by the Freikorps, a group of volunteers used by the democratic government to crush them. And the communists clearly lacked the support needed to get rid of the Weimar Republic. The threat that the communists posed was exaggerated in Germany, probably because everybody at the time lived in the shadow of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and tended to overestimate the threat of communism in other countries. I mean, when the communists called everyone to boycott the Weimar election of 1919, there was an 83% turnout. So that shows, the limited popularity of the communists. But likewise, the far right, their popularity is over-exaggerated in the early years. I mean, the Kapp Putsch of 1920 failed because the workers in the cities went on strike against it, well, particularly in Berlin. And, of course, the Munich Putsch, 1923, Hitler's one, was a disaster. The police opened fire on the Nazis demonstrating and shot 16 of them. And Hitler was carted off and spent about 7 months in prison. But the whole thing got nowhere. I mean, it did get Hitler the oxygen of publicity. But, the idea that the far right were about to overthrow the Weimar Republic in the early years is wrong. And they also didn't have electoral support either. I mean, if the Treaty of Versailles is the reason why Hitler came to power, you have to ask yourself the question, Why didn't political parties in Germany that disagreed with the Treaty of Versailles, right-wing political parties, why didn't they get more votes early on in the Weimar period? The main conservative party in Germany at the time was the DMVP, the Deutsche Nationalvolkische Partei, the German National People's Party, known usually as the Nationalists, and they got a chunk of the votes in the early years, but they never got anywhere near the kind of votes that parties like the SPD, the Democratic Socialist Party, that believed in democracy, were getting. So if everyone thought that the November criminals shouldn't have made the armistice and shouldn't have signed the Treaty of Versailles and all this stuff, well, why weren't they voting for the nationalists? Why weren't they voting for political parties that, though not as extreme as Hitler, were more sceptical about agreeing to the Treaty of Versailles? The answer is because in the early years of the Weimar Republic, all the evidence suggests the majority of the German people wanted to give democracy a chance and believed that the alternative to accepting the signing of the Treaty of Versailles would be the resumption of the war again, which nobody wanted. And the idea, therefore, that a groundswell of feeling against the reparations and a nationalist tradition in Germany is what inevitably led to the rise of Hitler to get rid of the Weimar Republic, I don't think holds sway.